The lake looked like glass. Jonas Miller stood at the end of the weathered dock, tying off a rope that didn't really need tying. It was just what he did every morning. Habit, routine. He liked the stillness out here at Echo Pine Lake, the silence, the space, the feeling that no one expected anything from him anymore. The rain had passed in the night, and now everything gleamed with that sharp, clean shine that only came after a storm. Behind him, Ranger let out a low growl. Not the kind that meant a deer was nearby, not playful, not even cautious. This one was low and certain. Jonas didn't turn immediately. He tightened the knot slowly. "What is it, boy?" Ranger's ears were up. His whole body had gone rigid, front paw lifted, eyes locked on something near the shoreline. Jonas followed his gaze. Just mud, washed up driftwood, maybe an old tire poking from the dirt. But then he saw it. A flash of metal, about 15 feet from the dock. Where the waterline had receded, something thick and rust-colored was poking through the earth. A chain. No, bigger than a regular chain. Industrial. Old. Heavy. Ranger took a single step forward and barked. Short, sharp, commanding. Jonas felt it in his chest. He took a breath and walked over, the mud sucking at his boots. He crouched beside the exposed metal and reached out, brushing away the wet pine needles. Thick links, the size of his wrist. They were corroded and pitted, but they still held a strange, silent power. The chain disappeared into the ground and then angled downward into the shallows of the lake. Ranger stood beside him now, his tail stiff, his nose twitching hard. "Well, hell," Jonas muttered. "What are you hiding?" The dog didn't move. His eyes never left the chain. Jonas gave one of the links a tentative tug. It didn't budge. He leaned back, putting more weight into it. Still nothing. Then the lake answered. A creek, dull and wet, somewhere just beneath the surface. Ranger growled, his teeth barely bared, ears flattened back now. Jonas froze, hand still on the chain. That sound hadn't been imagined. Something shifted under there, something big, something old. The hair on his arms rose. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something stranger, like waking up and realizing the quiet world around you had been watching all along. The clouds thinned. Sunlight spilled across the water, and in the reflection Jonas saw his own face, creased, grizzled, mouth drawn. But behind it, for just a second, he thought he saw something else. Movement, deep under the surface. He stood up slowly, brushing his hands on his jeans, his heart starting to beat just a little faster. Ranger looked up at him. "You think we should pull it up?" Ranger barked once. No hesitation. Jonas almost laughed. "You're serious?" The dog didn't flinch, didn't wag, just waited. That was the thing about Ranger. He didn't bark without reason. He didn't spook easy. This wasn't a raccoon in the brush or a fish, too, close to shore. This was different. Jonas looked out across the lake. The water was flat again, still, as if daring him to move. He turned toward the cabin, eyes narrowing. "All right, then," he said quietly. "Let's see what time left behind." As he walked away, he didn't notice the subtle shift in Ranger's posture or how the dog's head turned one last time towards the chain. The wind picked up, sending ripples across the surface. And for a moment, just a moment, the exposed link of metal trembled ever so slightly, like it had been waiting to breathe. Back at the porch, Jonas opened the old tool chest, pulled out a set of gloves, and slung a pulley rope over his shoulder. "You better not be leading me into something we can't get out of," he muttered. Ranger just trotted ahead, tail down, head up, like he already knew what came next. Jonas still remembered the smell of scorched concrete, the kind that burned into your lungs and stayed there for days, clinging to your uniform, your skin, your memory. It had been 2 years ago, Halfway across the world, a night mission turned sideways when a drone strike hit the wrong coordinates. They'd been called in to search what was left of a civilian depot. Under a pile of rebar and shattered tile, they found a crate. Locked, small, rattling from the inside. Ranger wasn't his then. He was just a number in a working unit, military working dog the 7451. The handler had gone down in the blast. By the time they reached him, Ranger was silent, curled in the back of the crate, muzzle streaked with dried blood, one paw crushed, ears cut and twitching. But his eyes were awake, too awake. Jonas had been the first one to reach in. Gloved hands, slow voice. "I've got you," he'd said over and over. "You're not staying here." Ranger hadn't growled, hadn't barked, just let him lift him out like he'd been waiting for someone to remember. They spent a month together in recovery at a base in Ramstein. Jonas wasn't even supposed to be there, just a tech rotated forward to fix damaged comms. But he stayed on, quietly signed papers, paid a ridiculous transfer fee, didn't tell anyone until Ranger was in his truck, heading home. He didn't need medals. He needed a reason to breathe. Now Ranger walked with only the faintest limp. His gait was smooth in the back country, but Jonas still caught it on colder mornings when the scar tissue around that paw would tighten. The vet had called it a miracle. Jonas called it resilience. They lived simple. A cabin tucked between pine and mist, a short walk from Echo Pine Lake. Jonas worked part-time fixing the old maintenance boats for the ranger station, half out of boredom, half because someone had to. Ranger followed him everywhere. No leash, no commands, just presence. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Every morning was the same. Coffee on the porch. Ranger doing his loop around the perimeter, nose to the ground, ears rotating like radar. Then they'd walk the shoreline, check the dock, hammer down loose boards, replace cracked planks. The smell of pine sap and lake water clung to Jonas's jacket now, same as it clung to Ranger's coat. But lately something had shifted. Jonas couldn't say exactly what. The lake was quieter. The usual bird calls cut off halfway. The fog took longer to lift. Some mornings, Ranger would stop mid-stride, body tense, ears tilted toward the water. Not afraid, but alert, listening. One morning, Jonas found Ranger staring across the lake, head tilted like he was trying to catch a whisper. "You see something?" he asked. The dog didn't respond, just kept staring. It had been like this ever since the storm, ever since the water dropped and that chain surfaced from the mud. Jonas hadn't mentioned it to anyone yet, not even the ranger crew. He told himself it was nothing, leftover scrap from the old lumber camps. Oregon was full of forgotten machinery, especially in backwoods lakes like Echo Pine. But Ranger didn't act like it was nothing. And that made Jonas listen harder. That afternoon, while repairing the latch on one of the aluminum patrol boats, Jonas paused. Ranger was pacing along the tree line, slower than usual, head low. The boat latch was rusted clean through, something he should have caught weeks ago. But lately, his head hadn't been right. Too many memories creeping in. Maybe it was the sound of that chain creaking under the water. Maybe it was Ranger's bark from that morning, the one that felt too pointed to ignore. He tightened the last bolt, wiped the grease from his hands, and called out, "Come on, bud." Ranger trotted over, still silent. They walked the trail home without a word between them. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, Jonas stirred the coals in the fireplace. Ranger lay on the rug near his boots, eyes half closed but ears still tuned to the outside. Jonas stared into the fire. "You remember that first night in the crate?" he asked quietly. "The way you wouldn't make a sound." Ranger opened one eye. "I thought maybe you'd never bark again." The dog blinked. "But this morning, that wasn't just a bark." Ranger lifted his head now, watching him. "That was a warning." Jonas leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The fire snapped and popped, casting flickers of orange along the walls. I don't know what's under that lake, but I know you've never looked at anything like that before. Ranger's eyes stayed on him, unmoving, listening. The air inside the cabin shifted, like something bracing for what came next. Jonas leaned back in his chair, letting the quiet settle in. The lake had secrets. That much was clear now. He just wasn't sure if they were meant to stay buried. But if Ranger had barked, that meant something had stirred. Something old. Something waiting. And tomorrow, they were going back. Chain or not. Together. The rain had come again in the night, louder, this time, drumming on the tin roof like it was trying to shake something loose. Jonas hadn't slept well. When he finally did drift off, it was with the image of that chain burned into his thoughts, the way it disappeared into the lake like a thread left behind by something that didn't want to be found. By morning, the storm had passed. Fog hung low over Echo Pine Lake, heavy enough to swallow sound. Jonas stepped out onto the porch with his coffee, the steam curling into the chilled air. Ranger was already pacing near the tree line, nose twitching, body tense. He hadn't even touched breakfast. Jonas watched him for a moment. "You're still thinking about it, huh?" Ranger froze, ears high, then bolted towards the shoreline with sudden urgency. Jonas followed, boots squelching through soft earth. When he reached the edge of the lake, Ranger was already there, standing like a statue. Tail straight out, legs braced, growling low. The chain was still there, half submerged in the muck. It hadn't moved. Even after the rain, the thick mud had settled the same way, and the same length of corroded metal still arched from the earth like a buried spine. Jonas took a few steps forward. The metallic scent in the air was stronger today. Not just rust, something sharp and unnatural, like oil or scorched wires. It clung to the back of his throat. Ranger didn't growl often, but now his hackles were up. His body was drawn so tight he looked like a wire ready to snap. "Easy, boy," Jonas said, crouching near the chain. "Let's just see what you're so worked up about." He reached for the nearest link, gripping it with both hands and pulling back. It didn't budge. He braced his foot against a root, leaned in with his weight, and yanked harder. Something gave. Not the chain, not entirely. But somewhere beneath the surface, something shifted. The sound was subtle but unmistakable, a deep groan, like the hull of a ship turning under pressure. Slow, reluctant, alive. Jonas let go fast. The chain jerked slightly, then stilled. He looked at Ranger, who was now circling behind him, agitated. The dog's eyes were locked on the water, tail stiff, nose twitching like a radar locked onto something just out of sight. "You heard it too, didn't you?" Jonas whispered. Ranger responded with a single, sharp bark. Jonas stood up, wiping mud from his hands onto his jeans. That wasn't debris. That wasn't an old anchor or part of a dock. That was something heavy, anchored, sealed, and still connected. The fog above the lake began to shift, parting just enough for the sun to catch the surface. The water looked calm again, but Jonas didn't buy it. Not anymore. He knew enough about mechanical systems to recognize when a structure was under tension. This thing, whatever it was holding. He turned back toward the cabin. Ranger didn't follow. The dog stayed put, guarding the chain like it might decide to escape. Jonas hesitated. "Come on, Ranger. We're not hauling it out today." Ranger didn't move. The silence between them felt different now. He wasn't just being stubborn. He was standing his ground. Jonas sighed. "Fine. Just keep an eye on it." He took a few steps, then paused. The air felt wrong. Thicker, charged. And that smell. It wasn't fading. It was stronger now, heavier than just rain on rust. He glanced back one last time. Ranger was still there, his body angled towards the water, watching something Jonas couldn't see, something that hadn't finished moving yet. By midday the next day, the sun was sharp enough to make the lake look harmless again. The fog had burned off, leaving the water still and glittering under a bright sky. It didn't seem like the kind of place that could hide anything sinister beneath it. That helped Jonas convince himself it was nothing, at least for a while. He stopped by the ranger station later that afternoon. The place was quiet, just a radio murmuring in the background and the smell of coffee that had been reheated too many times. Ranger waited outside, pacing along the truck bed, his tail brushing the dust off the side panel. Inside, Jonas found Kyle, the senior ranger on duty, hunched over a map. "Water line's dropping again," Kyle said without looking up. "If this keeps up, we'll be able to walk halfway across the lake by winter." Jonas gave a dry laugh. "Might find some treasure down there." Kyle looked up, eyebrow raised. "You dig something up?" Jonas hesitated. He thought about the chain, about the way it groaned under the surface like a creature turning in its sleep. Then he shrugged. "Just an old piece of metal, probably from before the dam. The dog found it. Big chain, heavy stuff." "Old logging gear, maybe," Kyle said, nodding. "Those mills used to anchor platforms all over this valley." "Yeah," Jonas said. "That makes sense." He took a sip from the mug Kyle handed him, even though the coffee was bitter enough to taste like dirt. He didn't mention the metallic smell or the sound from below. He didn't mention how Ranger hadn't left the shoreline since yesterday. It felt stupid to bring it up, and he didn't want to sound like the kind of man who heard ghosts in water. When he walked back outside, Ranger was still staring at the lake. Jonas sighed and reached down to scratch the back of his neck. "We're letting it go, all right? Nothing worth digging into?" Ranger didn't look at him. His gaze stayed locked on the same stretch of water, silent and fixed. It wasn't defiance. It was certainty. The dog knew something. Jonas felt it like a pressure behind his ribs. That night, the wind shifted. The cabin creaked as the temperature dropped, and the pine trees outside rubbed together with a sound like old ropes twisting. Jonas sat by the window with a glass of whiskey, staring out at the lake. The moonlight made it look flat again. Smooth, silver, almost peaceful. If he didn't know better, he would have believed it. Ranger was lying near the door, awake. Jonas could hear his slow breathing, steady but uneasy. "You're not over it either, huh?" Jonas said, voice low. "Whatever's out there, it's got you worked up." The dog lifted his head. His eyes caught the reflection of the firelight. Bright, intelligent, waiting. Jonas rubbed his face with one hand. "It's nothing. Probably a piece of old machinery. You hear me?" Ranger blinked, but didn't move. Jonas's patience snapped faster than he expected. "It's just junk, okay? Drop it." Ranger's ears flattened. He stood, gave one short exhale through his nose, and walked toward the door. The sound of his nails tapping against the floor was soft but sharp. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and stepped out onto the porch without looking back. Jonas cursed under his breath. Fine. Be that way. He poured another drink he didn't need, then turned the radio on low, hoping for distraction. Static. Then a local weather report. Clear skies, mild wind. Nothing unusual. The kind of night people slept easy. But Jonas didn't. The bed felt too big, the air too quiet. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the chain again, rising out of the mud like a scar. He heard the groan of metal, the deep, old sound that didn't belong to the world above. At one point he sat up, thinking he'd heard something outside, a low thump near the dock. But when he peered through the window, there was nothing, only mist rolling over the lake's surface. He lay back down, but his pulse wouldn't slow. He thought about Ranger out there on the porch, keeping watch. That dog had saved his life more than once overseas. He trusted his instincts more than any machine he'd ever built. So why was he ignoring them now? Jonas rolled onto his side and stared into the dark, the ceiling just a shadow overhead. Something under that lake was pulling at him, not in a supernatural way, but in the quiet, practical way truth does. You don't want to look at it, but it keeps tugging. Outside, Ranger shifted. Jonas could hear the faint jingle of his collar, the low rumble of a growl that faded almost as quickly as it began. Jonas whispered into the dark, "You're not the only one who can't sleep." The night answered with silence. He didn't know it yet, but by morning, that silence would break again. And this time, the lake would answer back. Jonas was already up before the sky had fully turned. The lake outside was veiled in mist again, thicker this time, clinging low like it didn't want to let go of whatever was buried beneath it. He didn't say a word as he loaded the old pulley system into the back of his truck. No breakfast, just black coffee and the hollow churn of his thoughts. Ranger sat in the truck bed, still and alert, watching his every movement. Jonas wasn't exactly sure what he was planning to do, but he knew he couldn't leave the chain alone anymore. Whatever was down there had stirred something, not just in the lake, but in him. At the shoreline, the earth was soft from the last 2 days of rain. Mud squelched under his boots as he set up the winch system. He wrapped the tow line around a thick pine trunk and locked the brake into place. Every knot he tied was second nature, muscle memory from years spent rigging downed aircraft and heavy gear, the kind of training that stayed with you. Ranger stood just behind him, ears pricked, eyes on the water. He hadn't made a sound all morning. Jonas gave the handle a test crank. Smooth, tight. He walked over to the chain and wrapped a thick loop through one of the uppermost links, locking it in with a steel hook. "You ready?" he asked, glancing at Ranger. The dog didn't move, just blinked once. Steady, watching. Jonas gripped the winch handle and began to turn. At first, nothing happened. The line went taut, the chain resisted, buried deep in mud and time. He leaned his weight into the crank, jaw clenched, breath slow and measured. A low groan drifted from the lake. Ranger's ears twitched. Then he let out a short, sharp bark, louder than usual. Not warning, not panic, command. Jonas froze, his hand still on the handle. The lake bubbled. Not small bubbles, not the random burst of trapped rainwater. These were thick, rising columns of air, gathered and rising as if the lake was exhaling after years of holding its breath. He turned the crank again. Something shifted. A length of the chain rose, thick links peeling out of the muck with the sound of tearing roots. Then, breaking through the surface, came a corner of rusted metal. Square. Dark. Heavy. Water streamed off it in curtains, thick with silt and algae. Jonas stepped closer. The shape rose higher, revealing the full frame of a steel hatch about the size of a cellar door. The welds around its edges were thick and uneven. Hand done. The metal was corroded, but intact. One edge was stamped with a line of faint lettering. He crouched, wiping away grime with his gloved thumb. U.S. Civil Defense Property, do not tamper. The words hit harder than he expected. He'd seen that kind of label before, in training, in manuals gathering dust in federal archives, Cold War era, emergency response units, civil bunkers, projects that were built with urgency and secrecy, then sealed and forgotten when the threat shifted or funding dried up. "What the hell?" he murmured. Ranger barked again, more urgent this time. The lake was bubbling faster now, the water around the hatch churning like something inside had stirred. Jonas stepped back instinctively. He hadn't opened anything. The hatch was still locked in place, partly submerged, but something had shifted when he moved it. Something below. Ranger paced behind him, body low to the ground, tail stiff, eyes locked on the metal. Jonas pulled his phone from his pocket and snapped a few photos. The lettering, the hatch, the bubbles. He tried to ignore the creeping sensation in his gut, that whatever this was, it had not been meant to resurface. "Buddy," he said without looking, "this isn't just old junk, is it?" Ranger growled, low and deep. Not aggressive, not afraid. Focused. Jonas crouched again, feeling the surface of the hatch with his fingers. The edges were solid. No signs of damage or corrosion through the welds. It had been sealed deliberately, not broken or lost. He stood and looked out over the lake. So much time had passed. Generations lived and died while this thing sat silent under the water. No markers, no records, just a rusted scar hidden beneath reflection. The chain groaned again, just a little. A vibration ran through the winch line. Subtle, like something down below had moved, just an inch. But that inch was enough. Jonas felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Ranger stepped forward and pressed his shoulder against Jonas's leg. Not fear, not resistance. Solidarity. Jonas exhaled through his nose, hand resting lightly on Ranger's back. "This thing was meant to stay down," he said. Ranger didn't move, but they both knew they were already in it now. And whatever was sealed beneath the lake had just started to wake up. By the time the government van rumbled to a stop at the ranger station, the sky over Echo Pine had turned a pale, expectant grey. The wind was steady now, pushing ripples across the surface of the lake. Jonas stood near the dock, arms crossed, watching the vehicle door swing open. Two men stepped out, both in black jackets marked with Oregon State Emergency Management. One of them, tall and lean with square shoulders and clipped speech, introduced himself as Aaron Blake, lead structural engineer. The other, younger, carried equipment and didn't speak much. Then came Lena Hale. She moved slower, with a stack of binders clutched to her chest, and a cautious look in her eyes that said she was used to asking questions no one wanted to answer. She was listed as a historical research liaison from the state archives, but her presence felt more deliberate. She wasn't just here to document, she was here to confirm. "You're Jonas Miller?" Blake asked, shaking his hand firmly. "Yeah." "You pulled up the hatch?" "Wasn't trying to," Jonas said. "It found me." Blake gave a small nod. "We brought sonar. If there's a structure down there, we'll find it." Behind them, Ranger stood silent, watching the water. He hadn't taken his eyes off it since they arrived. Blake and his assistant inflated a small raft and loaded it with a portable sonar scanner, a waterproof monitor, and an underwater camera drone. Lena stayed on shore with Jonas, flipping through old dam schematics and land surveys from the 1950s. "The reservoir was filled in 56, she said, pointing to a map. "Before that, this valley had a few sawmills, some scattered homesteads, nothing on record about bunkers or shelters." Jonas stared at the hatch through the mist, its rusted frame just visible at the water's edge. "That's not what it says." He showed her the photos he'd taken, the lettering, the welding seams, the official seal barely visible under grime. Lena's expression shifted. "That's Cold War civil defense labeling," she said. "We've seen it before on fallout shelters in the Cascades, but nothing in this region." "Maybe they forgot to write it down," Jonas said dryly. Lena didn't smile. On the raft, the sonar unit began to beep. Blake leaned over the monitor. "There's a cavity down there," he called. "Roughly 10 by 12 feet, not natural, reinforced corners, flat top, could be a sealed chamber." "Any signs of breach?" Lena asked. "No. Structure looks intact. We'll dive." The divers suited up fast. 2 of them, both calm, practiced. The moment they slipped under, Ranger barked. Once, it wasn't aggressive, but it was sharp enough to turn every head on shore. Jonas stepped beside him, resting a hand on his back. "What is it, buddy?" Ranger's body was tight again, but he didn't look at Jonas. His eyes were fixed on the water where the divers had disappeared. His tail was stiff, ears back. Not fear. Tension. "Something's wrong," Jonas said under his breath. Minutes passed. The sonar blipped. Bubbles rose in steady rhythm. Then static crackled on the radio. "Base, this is Diver 1. We're at the hatch. Chain is still attached externally. The welds are thick. Looks like it was sealed from above." "Can you breach?" Blake asked. "Working on it. Cutting torch is live." The torch flared somewhere beneath the surface, its glow invisible to those above. The monitor flickered, showing murky outlines of thick steel. Then the feed cut. Another minute. "Doors loose. Releasing now." The lake surface twitched, sending out rings that broke the reflection of pine trees overhead. Then came silence. "Diver 1, report status," Blake said, tension creeping into his voice. There was a long pause. "It's a room," the diver finally said. "Preserved. We're inside now." Static. "Boxes, gear, shelf-mounted supplies, rations, helmets, paperwork." Another diver's voice cut in, thinner. "Found a clipboard. List of names." More silence. 6 names. "Any bodies?" Blake asked. "None yet." Jonas glanced at Lena. She was already flipping through her binder again, searching the indexes. Ranger growled low, deep in his chest. He'd moved to the edge of the dock now, body taut, muscles rippling under his coat. Jonas followed his gaze. A single bubble rose and popped. Then another. The hatch hadn't moved, but the lake didn't feel still anymore. Blake spoke again into the comms. "Mark everything. Bag what you can. Focus on any documentation." Minutes later, the divers surfaced, slow and quiet. Their eyes looked older than when they went in. On shore, they laid out the first findings. 1 tin of emergency water, a radiation symbol sign with edges curled and yellowed, a cracked helmet still bearing the black stamp, Civil Defense Volunteer Unit, and a clipboard with 6 names typed neatly down the page. No deceased, no transferred, no dates, just names. Lena read them twice, then a third time. "There's no record of any of these men in the final dam construction logs," she said quietly. "No reassignments, no exits. It's like they vanished." Ranger barked again. This time it echoed. Blake crouched near the edge of the dock, staring out. "If they sealed it, before the flood, and no one pulled them out." Lena's voice was dry. "Then this wasn't an accident." Jonas didn't speak. He looked out at the lake, where ripples still moved like the water had memory. Then he looked at Ranger, standing at the hatch's edge, body rigid, breathing slow and deep. "Whatever happened down there," Jonas said, "he still smells it." And he wasn't leaving until the rest of the truth surfaced. By late afternoon, the crew was quieter. The initial thrill of discovery had faded into something heavier. The lake wasn't just holding on to a secret anymore. It had offered up a piece of truth, and the weight of it was beginning to settle over everyone. Jonas stood with Lena near a folding table under a canvas tarp the divers had rigged for sorting recovered items. Ranger lay at his feet, still and watchful. His eyes tracked every movement, but he hadn't barked since that last echoing cry near the hatch. It was as if he understood. Now they weren't just uncovering metal and rust. They were digging up the dead. Lena flipped through one of the soaked binders recovered from the chamber, carefully lifting a page smeared with old ink. Most of the writing had bled out, but one corner was intact, typed on a manual typewriter, the letters sharp but faded. "Work log," she said. "Dated April 7th, 1956. Mentions welds completed. Structural reinforcements finalized. Waiting on inspection from federal team before sealing." Jonas leaned in. "What's the last entry?" She turned the page with gloved fingers. There, in shaky handwriting, was a single line. Flood control operation moved up. Sealing today. No evac confirmation. Jonas said nothing, but the muscles along his jaw tightened. There's no record. Lena said quietly. No logs showing they left. No memo approving their withdrawal. Nothing. He looked out at the water. They never got out. Ranger stood. His body went rigid, nose high, ears sharp. Then he moved, fast and silent, toward the tree line just north of the hatch site. His paws barely made a sound on the pine needles. Jonas followed without hesitation, calling back over his shoulder to Lena. He smells something. They reached the waterline, about 30 yards from the hatch. Ranger was already digging, frantic but focused. Mud flew in wet, clumps behind him. Then he stopped, barked once, and stepped back. Jonas crouched and reached into the earth. His fingers hit metal. It was another chain. Smaller than the first, older, mostly buried. He dug deeper, revealing a rusted loop attached to a rectangular metal box, locked shut, but not sealed. He pried it open with his pocket knife. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and lined with newspaper dated April 2nd, 1956, were photographs. 6 men, posing in front of the half-built shelter, laughing. One of them wore a hard hat with a name written in marker, Mickey. Beside the photos were personal items, an engraved lighter, a pocket watch with initials, a stack of pay stubs from the Department of Civil Defense. And tucked in the corner of the box, folded in half, was a handwritten note. Leave this above the line. If they forget us, let the water remember. Jonas read the line twice, then a third time. Lena arrived, breathless. She looked down at the contents of the box and froze. They knew, she whispered. They knew they might not make it out. She picked up the note with gloved hands, her voice unsteady now. This was never just a test site. This was a rushed job. No oversight, no accountability, and those men, they were left behind on purpose or forgotten by mistake. Jonas didn't answer. He looked at Ranger, who stood still now, staring out over the water with that same locked-in stare he'd had when they first found the hatch. That's why he wouldn't leave, Jonas said softly. He could smell them, not their scent, maybe, but something deeper, the memory of them, what they left behind. Lena sat on the ground, box in her lap, overwhelmed by the gravity of what they'd found. Do you know what this is? She said. This is proof, not just of the shelter, but of negligence. Human loss scrubbed out of records, these names. She held up one of the pay stubs. They're not in the archives, I checked. Then that's why they buried this. Jonas replied, because they knew history wouldn't remember them. He crouched next to Ranger and ran a hand over the dog's shoulder. You did good, bud. Ranger didn't move. His breathing was steady. His eyes didn't leave the lake. Back at the main site, Blake helped the divers organize what had already been recovered, but the urgency was gone. In its place was something more solemn. They were no longer pulling artifacts. They were pulling testimony. Lena stood, still holding the note. I'll submit this to the State Archive, she said. But I'll make copies too. I want people to see their faces, their handwriting, not just another blurred entry in a cold report. Jonas looked out over the water again. The lake didn't seem as calm anymore. It seemed watchful. A burial ground, disturbed just enough to whisper. They weren't ghosts, he said. They were working men who trusted the system to come back for them. Lena nodded. And it didn't. Ranger let out a breath, half sigh, half growl, and lay down by Jonas's boots, his chin resting on his paws. The movement was slow, purposeful, like he understood the story now, and knew it was no longer just about a hatch. By the end of the week, Echo Pine Lake wasn't just a quiet spot on the map anymore. It was on the local news first, Blurry footage of the hatch, a still shot of Jonas standing beside the chain, Ranger sitting at his side, ears up, eyes steady. The headline read, "Veteran uncovers forgotten Cold War shelter beneath rural Oregon lake." Then came the reporters, the trucks, the questions. Jonas hated all of it. He stood for one interview, mostly because the county office asked him to, and because Lena promised she'd speak with him after. The reporter shoved a mic under his chin, full of questions like, "How did it feel?" and "Did you know what you were pulling up?" Jonas answered the only way he could. "I wasn't trying to find anything," he said. "But once I knew what was down there, I couldn't ignore it. Someone had to speak for the ones who couldn't anymore." The media latched onto a phrase he didn't mean to say, buried alive by bureaucracy, and turned it into a tagline. He stopped giving interviews after that. But Ranger? Ranger didn't seem to mind the attention. People brought him treats, called him the hero dog, asked to take pictures with him by the dock. He tolerated it with quiet dignity, never barking, never straining the leash. Just standing beside Jonas like he always had, calm and composed, as if he understood that this was bigger than the two of them now. Lena stayed an extra week. She coordinated with the state archive, confirmed the names from the pay stubs and handwritten notes, and tracked down an old file that had been mislabeled in the construction logs. 6 men. No departure date, no reassignment, just gone. No families ever notified. No record of retrieval. Jonas sat beside her one afternoon in the ranger station, both of them hunched over the same table where he used to drink bad coffee and pretend to be retired. "I can't stop thinking about that note," Lena said quietly. "If they forget us, let the water remember." Jonas nodded. And it did. By the following Saturday, the town council had voted to erect a memorial. It wouldn't be fancy, just a stone marker with 6 names carved into it, and a small plaque explaining what had happened. Jonas was asked to write the inscription. He kept it short. "To those whose work was never meant to be buried, may their names rise above the water, even when history forgets." The ceremony took place under a cold, bright sky. About 30 people showed up, locals, a few veterans, even a high school civics teacher who brought her class, all bundled in scarves and looking vaguely awed. Jonas didn't stand with the crowd. He waited back by the tree line, one hand resting, lightly on Ranger's collar, watching from a distance. He didn't need to be seen. He just needed the names spoken out loud once. A woman from the council read them. Michael Davis, Arthur Lynn, Sam Keener, Luis Moreno, Daniel Price, Henry Stafford. Jonas closed his eyes for a moment. He didn't know their faces, but he could picture their hands, rough, calloused, covered in grease and grit. Builders, workers, men who were told to wait and who waited too long. After the ceremony, a few townspeople approached him. "You really pulled up a piece of history," one man said. Jonas shook his head. "I just pulled a chain. The rest was already there." The mayor gave him a commendation plaque. He accepted it politely, then set it on the porch of the ranger station, and never picked it up again. Someone handed Ranger a small medal, just a token with the town seal and the word Guardian etched into the side. Jonas clipped it to his collar without a word. Ranger didn't react, but he wore it like it had always belonged there. That night, the lake was quiet again. Jonas sat on the porch with a mug of coffee gone cold in his hands. Ranger lay at his feet, eyes closed, but ears twitching every few seconds, always listening. Lights from the ceremony still glowed faintly by the shoreline, casting long reflections across the water. The stone was in place now. Permanent. Real. Something that couldn't be erased by time or oversight. Jonas looked down at Ranger. "They'll forget again," he said quietly. "People always do, but maybe not right away." Ranger opened one eye. "And you?" Jonas gave a soft smile. You made sure they didn't stay forgotten." The dog didn't move, didn't need to, because in that moment, under the still sky and beside the lake that had once hidden everything, nothing needed to be said. The story was out. And it wasn't a celebration, it was a reckoning. And Ranger, just as he had from the very first bark, had known exactly what it was. The first snow came early that year. It blanketed the hills outside Jonas's cabin like a hush over a story finally told. The cabin, still patched with the scent of varnish from the repaired floorboards, felt quieter than usual. Though not empty. Not anymore. Jonas sat by the fire, a mug of black coffee cooling in his hands, untouched. The glow of the flames flickered across the walls, catching on the rough wooden shelf where he had placed a single object. A cleaned and polished link of the rusted chain Ranger had uncovered. It rested there like a relic, coiled in its own silence, but louder now than any scream. Ranger lay stretched out beside the hearth. His breathing was slow, deep, not tired, not wounded, just older. The greying fur around his muzzle caught the firelight, and for a moment Jonas could almost imagine him as the pup he'd trained years ago, fresh out of war and unsure of the world that didn't shoot back. The town had quieted. After the flurry of reporters, the camera crews, the ribbon cutting at the new memorial site, things had settled back into routine. But not for Jonas, not inside. Some nights, like this one, the memories knocked louder than any headline ever had. He leaned forward and looked into the flames. It wasn't the war that buried them, he muttered. It was paperwork, complacency, the kind of silence no one questions because it wears a tie and signs forms. He remembered the box of files he'd unearthed, the ones no one had wanted to open for decades. They hadn't screamed conspiracy. They'd whispered neglect, misfiled, forgotten, sanitized into irrelevance. And that was what scared him most. Not the ghosts, not the chain, but the quiet. Jonas stood and walked slowly to the shelf. He ran a thumb over the metal link, now smooth and gleaming. A week ago, he'd driven back to the site alone. No cameras, just him and Ranger. He'd walked the perimeter again, said their names out loud, each one of the 9 men that had died out there, each name now carved into stone back in town. He'd brought back this one link, just one, as a reminder, a burden, a promise. Behind him, Ranger stirred. The dog didn't lift his head, just wagged his tail once, then rested it again. "You remember, don't you?" Jonas whispered. "Even when no one else did. Even when I didn't want to." He crouched down beside the old shepherd, running a hand over his flank. "Sometimes," Jonas said softly, "all we want is to matter. Not to a crowd, not in the paper. Just to someone. To know that even when the noise dies down, someone still carries your name, your story." He looked back at the shelf. The link gleamed like a small truth no one could bury anymore. Even if it's just one dog who remembers. Ranger opened one eye, then closed it again. He didn't need to bark. He'd already said more than enough. Outside, the wind rose across the ridge, carrying the sound of the forest shifting under snow. Somewhere far off, a single owl called out, a long, low note cutting the silence. And in the warm glow of the fire, 2 veterans, 1 man, 1 dog, sat in a cabin that no longer held secrets. Only echoes, long ones, true ones. The porch hadn't changed much, still slightly slanted, still smelling of pine and tobacco. The lake beyond shimmered in its early autumn light, calm now, almost shy, as if it too remembered what had been dredged up from its muddy floor weeks ago. Jonas sat in his usual spot, a patched flannel shirt hanging loose over his shoulders. A tin coffee mug steamed quietly beside him. Ranger rested at his feet, muzzle grey, eyes half-lidded, but still tracking everything, always listening. The boy, Evan, maybe 16, fidgeted on the porch step, notebook open, pen twitching in nervous fingers. "My teacher said to interview someone who changed their community," he said, "and the librarian said I should come talk to you." Jonas didn't answer right away. He looked down at Ranger, who shifted slightly, thumping his tail once before returning to watch the tree line. "I read the article," the boy continued, voice unsure. "About the chain, the evidence, the missing man, and the army report you pushed through. It's crazy." Jonas smiled faintly. "Not crazy, just buried, like most truths." Evan hesitated. "Why did you even go digging that day? Why not just let it stay forgotten?" Jonas took a long breath. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, rusted link of the chain. Cleaned, polished, and now looped on a thin leather cord. He held it out for the boy to see. He barked at the water. Jonas said quietly. Ranger. Didn't growl, didn't whimper, just barked. Once, like it wasn't about fear, but about calling something out. Evan stared at the link. "You mean, he knew?" Jonas didn't nod. He didn't need to. "You see," he said slowly, "a man like me, we get old, and folks assume our war is over. They see the limp and think it's just from a bullet. They hear our silence and think it's because we've run out of things to say. But sometimes, silence is where the worst things hide." He turned and pointed toward the porch post, where a wooden sign hung crookedly, its letters etched deep with a blade and a purpose. He didn't bark for food. He barked for the truth. Evan's pen dropped a little. "That's powerful." "It's Ranger's legacy," Jonas said. "Not mine. I just listened." They sat in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. Ranger stretched, then slowly got to his feet. He stepped off the porch, walked to the edge of the yard, and sat facing the trees, alert, still, and somehow timeless. Evan finally said, I think this story is more than just about the lake. It's about what people choose to ignore." Jonas looked at him, and for the first time, his eyes softened into something close to pride. "You're getting it." The boy stood up, tucking his notebook under his arm. "Can I take a picture of the sign?" "Sure," Jonas replied. "But don't just write the words down. Write what they mean." As Evan raised his phone, Jonas watched Ranger, whose ears twitched at a sound no one else could hear. A breeze stirred through the trees. Not threatening, just aware. The dog remained perfectly still, watching, guarding. And Jonas smiled. Not the kind that says I'm fine, but the kind that says I still have work to do. Sometimes justice doesn't come from a courtroom. Sometimes it comes from a bark in the woods, a chain in the mud, and a man who finally listens. Ranger didn't just sniff out evidence. He unburied the truth others wanted forgotten. Not for medals, not for glory, but because someone had to. Now, as the boy walked down the path, Jonas whispered to the empty air beside him, to someone long gone, "I told you, buddy, you still matter." And the breeze shifted again, just enough to rustle the sign. He didn't bark for food. He barked for the truth. If this story stirred something in you, what's your story with a loyal pet? Subscribe to German Shepherd Stories. Share your bond, because some barks still echo long after the woods fall silent.